In July 2020, Thomas and Owen Graves set off on an adventitious to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. They begin a daydream from which they never returned. For the world, this story became a distant aphotic mystery. But for one woman, it was a tragedy that would aftermost forever. Great Smoky Mountains National Esplanade is a jewel of the American South, a dish across the bound amid Tennessee and North Carolina. Every year, millions of tourists appointment to adore the breathtaking views of bleary mountains, ancient forests, and bottom-ward waterfalls. But abaft this account, absolute beauty lies addition reality. It is added than 2,000 above-board kilometers of wild, untamed nature. Here, close forests blot sound and light. The acclimate changes in a matter of minutes, and corpuscle phone reception disappears aloof a few steps away from the capital day-tripper routes. It is a abode breadth, it is actual accessible to get lost and boxy to acquisition your way. 42-year-old Thomas Graves knew these forests. He was no amateur to hiking and had been exploring the Appalachian trails aback his youth. For him, hiking was not aloof a hobby, but a way to recharge and escape the problems that had afresh bedeviled his life. A year before these events, he absent his job as an architect and was about accepting by with acting jobs. His wife, Claire, would afterwards acquaint board that Thomas had collapsed into a deep depression. He became withdrawn, silent, and sometimes accurate strange, disturbing phrases. "If the apple assuredly collapses, Owen and I will aloof go into the woods," he told her one evening. "No one will acquisition us there." Claire didn't pay abundant attention to these words at the time, attributing them to accent and fatigue. The cruise was intended to be in befalling for Thomas to reconnect with his 11-year-old son, Owen. The boy adored his ancestor and shared his adulation of the accustomed world. For him, a 3-day cruise through the woods was an absolute adventure. They carefully planned their route, the Bug German Isle in the Chestnut Creek area, a moderately circuitous route designed to booty actually 3 canicule and 2 nights to complete. On the morning of July 15, 2020, Claire saw her husband and son off. She watched as they packed a tent, sleeping bags, food, and water into the car. Owen couldn't adumbrate his excitement, while Thomas seemed unusually calm, about detached. He hugged his wife goodbye and promised they would be back by the black of July 17th. By the evening of Friday, July 17th, they had not returned. At first, Claire remained calm. Anything can appear on a hike. They could accept been delayed, or they could accept absently to breach another night. But aback several hours anesthetized and their phones were still out of range, her all-overs began to about-face into panic. She knew her husband. He was responsible and consistently appear changes in plans whenever possible. By midnight, still cat and mouse for a call, she dialed the National Esplanade Accomplishment Service. On the other end of the line, she was assured that a convoying would be beatific out in the morning to chase for them. With the first application of the sun on July 18th, the search operation began. The Esplanade Rangers first arrested the parking lot at the start of the Bug German Trail. Their worst fears were confirmed. Thomas Graves' old auto barter was still where he had larboard it. This meant that the ancestor and son had not larboard the forest. They were still about out there in the vast, densely abounding area. The Rangers anon declared a full-scale alert. At that moment, no one knew that the chase would annoyance on for years, and that the aftereffect would be worse than anyone's affliction nightmare. The hope of award Thomas and Owen alive faded with every hour spent in the silent, bleary forests of the Great Smoky Mountains. On July 18, 2020, at the first ablaze of dawn, the parking lot at the Alpha of the Bug German Isle turned into a makeshift command center. Dozens of National Esplanade account vehicles, sheriff's appointment cars, and volunteer vehicles abounding the baby space. The air, usually abounding alone with bird song and the burst of leaves, now buzzed with the burst of radios and snippets of close conversation. The operation was led by Rick Holstead, one of the park's best experienced rangers, a man who in 30 years of service had witnessed aggregate in these mountains, from amazing rescues to adverse discoveries. His face was calm, but his eyes betrayed his acute concentration. He knew that the aboriginal 48 hours in such cases were crucial. The chase plan was standard but reliable. The all-inclusive area around the Bugerman Isle was divided into sectors. Anniversary Chase team consisting of rangers and experienced volunteers was assigned its own square. They were accurate from the air by a helicopter able with a thermal imager, which was to adjust the breadth in the hope of audition the calefaction of human bodies. Dog teams consisting of dogs trained to chase for bodies were sent along the aisle itself to try to aces up a scent. On paper, aggregate looked organized and efficient, but the reality of the Great Smoky Mountains quickly made its own adjustments. The chase teams encountered what local hikers alarm Heath Hell. These are dense, almost bulletproof thickets of evergreen shrubs that associate to form a solid wall. Progress through them was only accessible at an acceleration of a few hundred meters per hour, literally cutting an aisle through the thicket. Underfoot was slippery, clammy foliage that hid rocks and timberline roots. The terrain was dotted with abrupt ravines and gorges which were chancy to descend and appropriate advancing equipment. The helicopter accepted to be virtually useless. Alike in the average of summer, the close awning of copse created a solid blooming arch that actually hid the ground from appearance from the air and blocked the signals from the thermal imager. The dogs best up the trail from Thomas's auto truck, confidently leading the dog handlers forth the trail for about a mile, and a fresh stopped, confused. The aisle bankrupt off. It did not about face into the backwoods or advance to a stream. It disappeared. This was the first aberrant blow in this case. It was as if the ancestor and son had vanished at that point. Day afterwards day, hundreds of bodies combed the forest. They confused in apathetic chains, examining every bush, attractive beneath every boulder. They looked for any signs of human presence. A allotment of clothing, a discarded wrapper, traces of a fire, a broken branch, but there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. That was the most disturbing thing. Alike inexperienced hikers who get absent generally leave behind traces. Thomas Graves was an experienced hiker. He should accepted that in case of trouble, he bear to breach put, build a fire, and do aggregate accessible to make it easier for him to be found. However, the searchers begin no trace of a affected or alike in advance to establish one. Claire Graves backward at the command center the accomplished time. She lived in her car, abnegation to leave. Every few hours, Ranger Holstead would appear to her to report on the results, and anniversary time he had to say the exact words. Nothing yet, Mrs. Graves. But we're not giving up. She looked at him with eyes abounding of hope, which faded with anniversary casual day, replaced by dull despair. On the third day of the search, a typical summer storm hit the mountains. The sky blurred and torrents of water poured bottomward on the forest. The storm not only fabricated the chase on the ground extremely dangerous, but additionally destroyed any traces or scents that ability have remained. Afterwards, an anniversary of intensive searching, the operation was officially changed from an accomplishment to a search status. It was an academic but atrocious step, meaning that there was about no chance of award Thomas and Owen alive. The cardinal of volunteers began to dwindle. An anniversary later, the National Park Service appear the end of the active search phase. Rick Holstead appear at an abrupt columnist appointment that rangers would abide to convoying the area, but that the all-embracing operation was being wound down. For the world, the adventure of Thomas and Owen Graves became just another adverse statistic, an admonition of the dangers of the wilderness. But for Claire Graves, there was silence, a silence abounding with ambiguity that was more alarming than any terrible truth. She was larboard to appraise her questions alone. What happened on the isle that day? Why did an accomplished ambler and his son disappear afterwards a trace? The backwoods remained silent. A year passed, afresh another. The names of Thomas and Owen Graves were confused to the archives of baffling cases. It seemed that the Great Smoky Mountains would keep their abstruse forever. But 3 years after their disappearance, a chance discovery in an alien alone gorge would about face this abstruse adventure into a chilling nightmare. 3 years had passed. The calendar read August 2023. For millions of visitors, Great Smoky Mountains National Esplanade remained the same admirable abode to relax. The adventure of the dematerialization of the Graves ancestor and son had become a local legend, an alarming account sometimes told about the bivouac to warn tourists not to deviate from the trail. The case was clearly bankrupt and gathering dust in the archives. But the forest, which had kept it abstruse for so long, was accessible to acknowledge it. This happened not because of official searches, but by authentic chance. An accumulation of 3 clandestine trackers, enthusiasts who explored alone and rarely visited corners of the park, absently to explore an alien breadth of blooming Beer Mountain. Their ambition was to locate the charcoal of an old acreage that had existed in the early 20th aeon and was alone credible on old maps. To get there, they had to deviate from the abutting official isle for many kilometers, authoritative their way through wild, clear thicket. This was in breadth accustomed tourists did not adventure, and breadth alike rangers rarely went. In the afternoon, endlessly at the edge of a abysmal bouldered gorge to bolt their breath, one of the men noticed something strange. Abysmal below, amid the bags of boulders and collapsed trees, something glinted in the sun. It was not the reflection of baptize or wet rock. It was a sharp, unnatural, brownish glint. Intrigued, they abseitively to ascend down and investigate. The coast was continued and dangerous, and they had to use ropes to cross the steep breadth safely. As they approached the basal of the ravine, the boiling air grew heavier, and the smells of adulteration leaves and damp earth intensified. The antecedent of the shine was at the bottom of a behemothic tree, whose massive tentacle-like basis wrapped around a huge boulder. At first, the trackers saw a chain, an old rusty chain, one end of which was tightly wrapped about the root. And afresh they saw what the alternation led to. What they saw made their claret run cold. At the foot of the route, in a bank alveolate, lay two animal skeletons. One was noticeably larger, acceptance to an developed male. The other was small, acceptable acceptance to a child. They lay in aberrant positions, half hidden by a band of rotten leaves and moss that had accumulated over the course of 3 years. With abashed hands, one of the men contacted the rescue service. They miraculously managed to catch an anemic arresting on the backbone of the gorge. He struggled to acquisition the words to explain to the abettor what they had seen. Soon, the arena was cordoned off. For several days, this god-forsaken ravine became the centermost of a large-scale operation. Rangers, FBI agents, aback the abomination was committed on federal land, and an aggregation of forensic anthropologists descended aloft the site. The account they disconnected calm footfall by step was horrific. The remains undoubtedly belonged to Thomas and Owen Graves, as DNA testing would later confirm. Both skeletons were chained to a tree root. One alternation was captivated about the pelvic basic of the developed skeleton where a belt would about be placed. Another beneath alternation was attached to the wrist bones of the child's skeleton. The locks on the chains were old style without consecutive numbers and had been tightened by hand. The addle remains of their hiking jackets were found around them. Beneath the tree, almost completely active in the ground, lay the only 2 pieces of affirmation that spoke of the aftermost hours of their lives. A rusty metal baptize alembic and an empty faded adhesive from a Snickers chocolate bar. The armpit was about 12 kilometers in a straight band from the abutting isle, and almost 20 kilometers from the atom on the Bug-German isle breadth the graves were believed to accept disappeared. It was impossible to get actuality by accident. They had been brought actuality deliberately. For Claire Graves, the alarm she had been both cat and mouse for and afraid for 3 years assuredly came. Ranger Rick Holstead, the aforementioned one who had led the chase in 2020, acquainted it was his assignment to breach the account to her in person. He didn't go into details, saying alone that the charcoal of her husband and son had been found. The 3-year aeon of advancing uncertainty had appeared to an end, but it was replaced by the truth. A accuracy so abhorrent that it was about absurd to comprehend. The abstruseness of their dematerialization had been solved. But in its abode arose a new, alike added alarming mystery. Who could accept done such a thing? And why? When the charcoal of Thomas and Owen Graves were delivered to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, the case moved from the chase appearance to the appearance of meticulous analysis. Every cartilage fragment, every atom of decayed tissue, every decayed allotment of chain could authority the acknowledgement to the main question. Who did this? The after effects of the dissection and forensic examination alone deepened the mystery. The official account of afterlife for both was determined to be aridity and hypothermia, i.e. afterlife from appetite and overheating. There were actually no signs of violence on the basic afore their capture. No fractures from blows, no bullet wounds, no knife wounds. This meant that they were chained to the tree animate and advantageous and a fresh larboard to die a apathetic and aching death. The investigators focused their absorption on the affirmation begin at the scene. The chains were old-fashioned, the affectionate that could accept been lying in a barn on a farm for decades. The abridgment of markings made it absurd to trace their origin. The locks were athletic but straightforward. However, the most important and at the aforementioned time most horrifying assay was fabricated by forensic anthropologists. Upon abundant assay of Owen's skeleton, about credible parallel scratches were begin on the basic of his right forearm, the radius and ulna. Experts assured that the fingernails of his larboard Duke larboard these marks. It was a concrete account of the last desperate hours of his life. The boy, chained by one arm, approved afresh and again to ability for something, scratching his own bark to the cartilage or in helpless agony, aggravating to breach the animate ring from his wrist. What was he aggravating to reach? The answer to this catechism was begin in the decayed charcoal of Thomas Graves' trousers. In the ancillary pocket, forensic experts begin a minor, heavily rusted key. Expert assay accepted that this key fits both locks on the chains. This discovery rendered all the initial theories obsolete. The key to freedom had been there all along, aloof a meter away from the boy in the abridged of his dead or dying father. This detail transformed the arena from a simple brutal annihilation into articles sadistic and psychologically sophisticated. Now the assay team, consisting of FBI agents and rangers, had three main theories, anniversary with analytical flaws. The aboriginal theory, the best accessible at first glance, annihilation suicide. The board summoned Claire Graves for analytic again. Overcoming her grief, she accepted already added that her husband had been adversity from severe depression afterwards accident his job. His statement that were activity to the woods now articulate like a absolute foreshadowing. Could Thomas in an accompaniment of psychological breakdown accept absentatively to annihilate himself and booty his son with him, whom he did not appetite to leave in a crumbling world? This adaptation explained how they concluded up so far from the trail. Thomas himself had led his son there, but it completely fell afar aback it came to the detail about the key. If this was an act of a desperate father, why put the key in his pocket? It would except been added logical to bandy it abroad to aphorism out any possibility of rescue, or conversely, leave it in a credible abode to give his son a adventitious afterwards his death. The location of the key did not fit with the psychology of a suicide. The second version, an advance by a third party. Perhaps they encountered Addition in the forest who committed the crime. Detectives combed through all the archives of incidents in the park. They found a complaint Anachronist 2017, in which tourists appear an advancing hermit who lived in the backwoods and threatened people by throwing stones at them. But this adventure occurred 3 years before the Graves' disappearance. The identity of that actuality was never accustomed, and there were no new letters about him. It was too anemic a lead. The third version, the best advancing and adjoining on folklore, a bent element. The Green Beer area, breadth the bodies were found, had a bad acceptability amid the locals. There were assiduous rumors that in its best alien corners, there were alleged agrarian camps, settlements of marginalized people, biologic addicts, and bodies who had deliberately withdrawn from society. An appropriate abode in these rumors was occupied by an accumulation alleged the coastal people. Allegedly birth of people evicted from these acreage aback the national esplanade was created who adhered to their own barbarous backwoods laws and were extremely adverse to outsiders. Could Thomas and Owen accept stumbled upon such a affected, or one of its representatives? This adaptation explained both the absorption of the breadth and the aberrant about August attributes of the massacre. But these were only rumors. The FBI and Rangers conducted several raids in the doubtable areas, but found no such affected and no suspects. The assay had accomplished a complete dead end. Anniversary adaptation aloft more questions than it answered. The evidence was affecting but contradictory. The investigators had an abomination scene, victims, and the annihilation weapon, chains, but they had no suspects and, most importantly, no credible motive that could explain such barbaric cruelty. The active appearance of the FBI investigation gradually petered out. Investigators interviewed hundreds of people, checked the alibis of dozens of individuals of operational interest, combed through tons of archival data, but never came close to analytic the case. Ultimately, in Aboriginal 2024, the agency issued an official statement. The case of Thomas and Owen Graves remained unsolved. Federal authorities classified the crime as actionable imprisonment consistent in death, which was dry acknowledged accent for describing doubtful cruelty. The case was not closed. It became cold, a file that would sit on a shelf until new evidence or a attestant came forward. If that any time happened, the investigation's last achievement was science. The chains and key were beatific to the FBI's forensic laboratory in Quantico for the most thorough assay possible. The experts looked for diminutive traces, particles of bark beneath the links of the chain, the isotopic agreement of the metal, which could announce the arena breadth it was manufactured, micro scratches on the key that could accord to a specific type of acid machine. But 3 years spent in the rain and scorching sun had done their job. Any traces of DNA had continued aback been destroyed by nature. The metal of the chains was too old and breakable to provide any accessible information. The key had no different markings. The science that was able to accord names back to the skeletons was clumsy to name the person who had placed them there. For Claire Graves, the official cessation of the investigation was not the end of her personal struggle. Her grief, which had previously been quiet and internal, now spilled out into a loud and desperate search for justice, or at least accountability. She filed a multi-million-dollar accusation against the U.S. National Espionage Service. Her lawyers argued that the account had bootless to ensure the assurance of visitors on its property. They cited rumors of wild camps and an old adventure involving an aggressive tourist, claiming that park administrators were acquainted of potential threats on alien trails, but had not taken acceptable measures to convoying or warn tourists. The Esplanade account in turn took a arresting stance, arguing that it was absurd to ensure complete safety in a breadth of added than 2,000 square kilometers of wilderness, and that visitors should be acquainted of the risks when activity on a hike. For Claire, this lawsuit, which is still ongoing, is not an advance to access compensation. Rather, it is the alone actual way to prevent the adventure of her bedmate and son from actuality forgotten. She additionally anchored the accession of a small canonizing applique in the boondocks of Cherokee at one of the entrances to the national park. The Abel bronze plaque is engraved with simple words in memory of Thomas and Owen Graves. Lost in these mountains in July 2020. May they acquisition the accord they did not find in life. Tourists casual by stop for a moment, read the inscription, and conceivably feel a slight Arctic as they boring at the majestic but aloof Abundance peaks. The abstruseness of what happened to Thomas and Owen Graves' charcoal unsolved. Was it an aberrant act by an atrocious father whose apperception was atramentus by depression? Or were they the adventitious victims of a violent, anchorous attention his territory? Or conceivably the accuracy is alike more terrifying and affiliated to aphotic legends about bodies active in the woods according to their own archaic laws. The answers to these questions will most likely never be found. They remain forever there in that alien gorge along with the blight on the old chains and the silence of the age-old forest. The story of their deaths has become allotment of the grim ballad of the Great Smoky Mountains. An abrupt admonition that the darkest secrets can be hidden in the most admirable places on earth.